A return to business as our governing institutions spring back into life. New ways in a new world for Parliament, and a reminder that all arms of the state are engaged in this fight. As we grapple with this pandemic, the bargain at the heart of any democracy is being tested. Our rulers are asking us to change our lives in unimaginable ways in exchange for them shepherding us through this emergency. And a clear signal today, social distancing measures may have to remain in place for over a year.
In the long run, the exit from this is going to be one of two things, ideally, one of which is a highly effective vaccine, and there are a variety of ways vaccines can be deployed, and/or highly effective drugs so that people stop dying of this disease, even if they catch it, or which can prevent this disease in vulnerable people. Until we have those, and the probability of having those any time in the next calendar year are incredibly small, and I think we should be realistic about that, we're going to have to rely on other social measures, which of course are very socially disruptive.
And questions today about Britain's mixed record responding to the coronavirus. The UK is struggling to meet a target of 100,000 tests a day by the end of the month, just 8 days away. 22,814 tests were conducted yesterday, well short of the current capacity of 40,000 tests a day. Criticism of Matt Hancock for setting such an ambitious target, though it is more modest than one set by the Prime Minister.
We're going up from 5,000 to 10,000 to 250,000 a day.
And the struggle to provide enough personal protective equipment for NHS staff was illustrated by a painful journey from Turkey. Due to arrive over the weekend, the equipment finally arrived in the early hours of this morning. But the government has achieved its key target. The NHS has not been overwhelmed by patients requiring critical care. Matt Hancock said today that there are 3,000 spare critical care beds in the NHS, 3 times the number at the start of the crisis.
Kier Starmer.
In his first parliamentary outing as Labour leader, Kier Starmer offered praise and criticism.
And something's going wrong. And there's a pattern emerging here. We were slow into lockdown, slow on testing, slow on protective equipment, and now slow to take up these offers from British firms.
A fresh voice with a new style of questioning which can pack a punch. Ministers are frustrated that many of the difficulties they're experiencing, such as sourcing protective equipment, are replicated the world over. But they will need to show a story of success if this government is to carry the public with them on the long journey out of this pandemic.
What we've seen this week, for the very first time, there have been more negatives spoken about the government than positives. And people are really picking up some of those negatives about PPE, failure to deliver testing, the care home crisis and so on. And I think it's potentially only a matter of time before that plays out in a negative way in the government's ratings too. I think trust is absolutely crucial here to this exit strategy and people believing that there is a way out. What we found in the poll that we ran this weekend was that 63% of the population said that even if lockdown ended, they would be too scared to go out. And we found also that 49%, half of the population, are concerned that the government doesn't actually have an exit strategy at the moment. And I think that's something that is going to play out much more in the coming weeks as people are beginning to feel frustrated.
A former Labour Defence Minister has a bold solution to improve the government's response.
I think the real problem is people voicing hopes and aspirations, but without proper analysis and proper organisation. And quite frankly, that's why they need to involve the military more, because they're really used to identifying their objectives, moving fast towards them. They understand that time is a real factor, which the civil service doesn't really understand.
I do think the public understand there's no perfection in decision making and that mistakes will be made. But I think if the overall direction of travel shows improvement and gain, then the public will accept that on occasions and at times the government will not deliver on what it said it can deliver. Signs outside of what should be the season of hope.
but we all face a long wait until our mood can match the weather.
Nick Watt there. Well, joining us now, the Conservative peer and former Cabinet Minister Lord Willetts, and with me in the studio here, the Labour peer Steward Wood. Can I start with you, Lord Willetts? Do you accept what Kier Starmer was talking about today, a mismatch between what the government thinks is happening and says is happening and what is actually happening?
Now, I thought Kier Starmer missed out. There are two key objectives when all this began. One was, as we've just heard, that the NHS should not be overwhelmed. And the NHS does still have capacity. And the other challenge, of course, was to deliver lockdown. And lockdown is working, is widely accepted and has popular support. Contrast that with France, where it's been much more heavy-handed, an administrative form every time you leave your house, and support for the government and its policies much lower than here. And at the other extreme, the US, where the libertarians are marching in protest at any lockdown. So actually getting that right, getting that judgment right was a big call, and it has worked.
You'd accept, though, that lockdown is a means to an end, and what he was talking about was the practicalities, slowness in testing, slowness in procuring equipment, slowness in accepting offers of much needed help from private company. I mean, that's frankly unacceptable, isn't it?
Well, certainly there are clearly problems with PPE, and that's actually a global problem. The global demand for PPE is greater than the global supply currently. But yeah, there have been problems there. But overall, on the two key objectives, we are seeing them being sustained. And I think the debate is now shifting to how we move forward and get out of this. And in terms of the lessons from all this, I would say the lessons both on testing and on PPE is that you've got to have the public sector and the private sector working together. Some of the old structures where there appeared to be a kind of public sector monopoly didn't deliver testing and didn't deliver the PPE that we needed.
Steward Wood, would you accept nobody is expecting perfection at a time like this and a crisis like this?
Absolutely, and a lot of good leaders around the world have been upfront with their populations about that. Cuomo in New York, Macron in France. I think one of the interesting things is that our government seems very defensive about things that the public would understand. No one could have expected to be totally prepared for everything you'd need in this epidemic. And I think one of the problems that a lot of people have with their response on things like PPE, the testing, we're at 30% of diagnostic testing compared to the OECD 35 average. That's very low. Now, there is a way, I think, the government explaining that we were behind the curve for all sorts of reasons, and these are the things we're doing to put in place. Instead, we had, I think, a real mistake by the government on testing, for example, where they did what you do in kind of normal times. You set yourself a target by the end of April, and you say, this is the test by which we should be judged. In fact, we're probably not going to hit that. And even today, we heard Dominic Raab trying to shift the goalposts away from actual testing to capacity. That's the sort of politics of panic, I think, which we're starting to see. I think the public would understand if they were led a little bit more sort of behind the thinking of the government. At the moment, the government is playing normal politics at a time when good leaders in other countries realise that you can let people in a bit more.
David Willetts, do you accept that? I mean, when you heard Dominic Raab shift that whole debate about the testing goal to testing capacity, it made the government look even more out of touch that people hadn't been tested. I mean, as Kier Starmer came back.
Well, first of all, I agree with Steward Wood. This is not a normal time and not normal politics. I personally think that the style of the government has reflected the fact it's not a normal politics at all. On testing, there are two different questions. One is indeed capacity, physically able to do 100,000 tests. The other is who are the people who should be tested? How do you prioritise? How do you assess as the population?
Sorry, but I've got to come in there because when you're talking about capacity, you are losing your whole argument. If you're saying we have plenty of tests but people aren't getting them or aren't being able to get to them, that's proving the point of incompetence.
I don't think it's to do with incompetence. It's to do with the two separate questions. Of course, you need to install the capacity. And of course, we didn't have enough capacity early on. But then there's the question, how do you allocate it? Who are the people who need to receive the test? And here, and I accept Stuart's point, here you need an open debate about what are the priorities. To what extent should it be medical staff, care home staff, people working in key sectors? So deciding who gets the test is a legitimate matter of public debates, but it's not just simply accrued 100,000.
Stewart, do you accept that we might be getting obsessed with targets here? And if the government is, as it tells us, straining every sinew, do the public actually care about the fine details or the numbers or the targets?
They may not. It's probably one of those crises. I mean, it's the biggest crisis of my lifetime. It's probably what crisis in which ultimately will be judged fairly or unfairly by comparison with other countries. And at the moment, I think there's a sense that we're not doing very well compared to other countries. Actually, though, the most difficult moment, weirdly, for the government is yet to come, because the decision about how to unwind, as it were, the restrictions and when to do it is going to be the most difficult decision of all, because the responsibility for everything that happens will be kind of boiled back down to those decisions. And this is the moment, I think, when the government really has to bring the public in and be honest with them. It doesn't have to explain now the exit strategy. I get the sense that the government thinks if it said too much now about any exit strategy, people would suddenly think it's okay to go outside. They almost don't trust people to know that this is not for now. But this is a time to do milestones, the sequence by which we'd start slowly to unwind, which jobs would be first to start to go back, under what conditions. There are milestones that can be set out, and people can be trusted to understand that there's no timeline, but there is an understanding of a framework that will be kicking in later. That's what's happening in other countries, and I think people want that for here as well.
Do you think, David Willetts, that there is a sense that they're having to guard us from what is really happening? I mean, there have been some extraordinary decisions that we haven't been let in on. The EU procurement scheme is one where we heard that the government didn't get the email. We heard then that they did attend several meetings. Then they turned it down. Then Matt Hancock told us that we were part of it. Then a senior civil servant says that it's a political position. Hours later, it seems he's made to write a letter retracting everything he's just said. I mean, why can't they be frank about that? Why is there so much obfuscation about something that's probably got a legitimate decision and reasoning behind it?
Well, I think there's a relatively small number of people working under enormous pressure in an unprecedented crisis who are delivering so far the key objectives. The NHS is up and functioning, has not been overwhelmed. The lockdown is also functioning as accepted. That actually compares pretty well with most other Western countries. The Asian countries that have had SARS have by and large been better prepared.
But this is about communication, isn't it? And as Stewart was saying, it's really important that you take the public with you for the next steps, which are going to be critical. And if people are starting to feel that they're getting muddled messaging or that we're not being somehow told one straight thing, then it becomes much harder to bring people with you.
Yes, it's really important that people carry on getting the unvarnished direct truth. I agree with you. And I think so far, levels of public support for the lockdown and for this government's handling have remained high. But I agree with Stewart. The next challenge is indeed how we get out of this. It looks like it's going to have to be a step-by-step process. Yeah. You can put out a neat logical sequence, but you can start indicating the sectors where the reproduction rate is down below 1.
I want to throw your thought at Stewart before we end. Do you accept that actually the public is largely still behind the government and the strategy on this one?
Yes, I agree with David. There have been successes. I think once the lockdown started, I think it's been a success behaviourally. There was clarity about what people were expected to do. I think that's worked. The next phase is going to be much more varied, though. It's going to be different things for different people, depending on where you work, maybe what towns you're in. And I think that subtlety and that difference is going to require honesty much more up front. And I think in Boris Johnson, we wish him well. We hope he comes back to work. I think Boris Johnson, whatever you think of him, I'm obviously not a fan, is a communicator-in-chief and an explainer-in-chief. And I think he's going to have to bear a lot of the responsibility for the next wave of messages.
Thank you both very much indeed. Thanks for coming in.